So, welcome everybody to this webinar on a blended diet for tube feeding that's been very kindly delivered by Gareth Burkett, who's from Wilbo's Blended Food. Wilbo's Blends, I think you're called, Gareth, is that right?
Yep.
And Gareth launched his company to make real blended food available to people who are being tube fed. And he was inspired by his son, who is on a blended diet journey. And his mission is to transform nutrition by delivering convenience, choice, and improved well-being for patients and families worldwide. And also, this is a great opportunity to thank Gareth for coming to our family conference in Birmingham on Saturday as well. So thank you for that as well, Gareth. I'm going to stop sharing my slide now, but this is just a slide for those of you here, telling you a little bit about what we do at Unique. And if you've enjoyed this webinar or any of our other resources, please feel free to make a donation on our website or get in touch with us if you've got any questions. And without further ado, Gareth, I'm going to stop sharing and let you share. And please, everyone else, please feel free to put any questions along the way in the chat, and then at the end we can put those questions to Gareth, and he can answer them. Thank you, Gareth. All yours.
Lovely. And you can see those slides okay now?
Yeah, perfect.
Fabulous. And as I say, I can't see the chat, but if people have got questions, if somebody can let me know, and I'm happy to, given it's a relatively small group, answer questions as we go along. Otherwise, people just forget what the questions are. So
I'm
happy to.
happy to do that, Gareth. If you're happy to be sort of interrupted by me along the way, I'll,
Absolutely.
I'll
I'm
do
very happy.
that.
And I'll leave a bit of time at the end for any other questions, but please don't feel you have to wait till then to ask any questions. So
Perfect.
I'm going to introduce the concept of a blended diet, which maybe some people know well and others don't. And then I'm going to provide a little bit of context into why we're seeing a big growth in the adoption of blended diet for people that are using enteral nutrition. And then I'm going to cover some of the challenges that come along with that, because there are some, things are improving a lot, but there's still a long way to go. And then I'm going to use the framework of evidence-based practice to unpack a little bit more of the detail behind that. And then I'm going to quickly go into introduce you to William, I suppose, or Wilbo, and then into Wilbo's blends and kind of what we do and what we have available, I suppose, in all aspects of blended diet, not just kind of our meals, which I'll cover at that point. So what is a blended diet? There's a few different definitions, and if you look at more of the US-centric literature, it talks about blenderized diet or liquid diet. There's lots of different phrases that are used, but generally it's just everyday foods that are blended with a liquid to be given for an enteral feeding tube. And I'll talk a little bit about the different feeding tubes. Sometimes you'll see a definition that says it doesn't include breast milk or formula milk for babies, which makes good sense. But ultimately, what we're talking about is just real food that's been used for tube feeding. Who uses it, and I'll talk a bit about the history of it and where it came from. But broadly speaking, anybody that's got an enteral feeding tube, be it an NG tube, gastrostomy tube, even we see people with post-pyloric, so feeding J tubes past the pylorus in the stomach. So it's a whole group of people, but in the vast majority, it's still weighted towards pediatric patients. It's growing in adults, but it's still very big, especially in the UK in pediatric. And I suppose if I think about it geographically, the US in pockets is probably the most advanced place in the adoption of blended diet, followed by the UK, Scandinavia, and Australia. But we're seeing the same trends globally now of more people adopting this. What percentage? So from the UK, there's not great data collected by anybody, but we think it's about 20%, but increasing all the time of the people that are adopting it for good reason. And there's hundreds of research papers and clinical research studies that have been done on blended diet, which reinforces the evidence base supporting it as well. So just to give some context, I'll not dwell too much on the ancient Egypt bit, but people have been using enteral nutrition for a long time. It wasn't a pretty process back in ancient Egypt from the evidence we've got, so we don't need to think about that too much because it doesn't sound very pleasant. But then in the 60s, commercial formula, as more people were using enteral nutrition, commercial formula became available. And before that, blended food was kind of available, but it was largely milk and sugars being mixed together, honey and things like that being mixed together. But then in the 80s, more people started getting PEG procedures, and then the commercial formulas started being called the gold standard by the companies that make them. And since then, it hasn't really changed, to be honest. Enteral formulas are still the de facto starting place for everybody that goes onto a feeding tube of any description. But in the kind of 2000s, maybe 2010s, people started pushing back against it and saying it wasn't right for people. People were living a lot longer and using feeding tubes for a lot longer. And we started to see the re-emergence of this concept of real food, blended diets, being used for many years by some people, because the evidence suggests, at the time there was limited evidence, but the evidence suggests that having more dietary variety and real food is a healthier way, as we would suggest to anybody that was eating orally, which applies to everybody else. And in the BDA, who's the British Dietetic Association, so from a UK perspective, they updated their policy statement to say that blended diet should be, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it should be, not rejected out of hand, which it was before that. And then that's advanced a bit further with an updated statement where it's a shared decision model. They developed the BDA toolkit, which came out in 2021, which is to support clinicians and dietitians on how to deliver a blended diet, which is getting updated in September. We'll see hopefully in September, it's nearly finished. The new toolkit, which will have a multidisciplinary review from BAPEN, and that just shows the wider acceptance from the clinical teams of blended diet. And there's a lot of clinicians now that are very proactively pushing people to blended diet to manage a lot of the problems that come from formula, which I'll cover here. So the primary reason that most people start the blended diet is because they have GI intolerance. So that becomes very visible to people very quickly. They're vomiting. Often it's called reflux, but most of the time when you look into it, it's more that they're just vomiting from intolerance. Diarrhea is very prevalent, and so is constipation, sometimes together, crazily. But then also some of the less tangible things outside the GI tolerance, like just having better skin, better hair, better growth, reduction in seizures in some cases. I absolutely saw that, and I've heard that anecdotally from lots of other people. And then there's a big part of this psychosocial part of it, which is inclusion. And we all know that you end up in this situation not out of choice, and you're in a medically complex situation that you don't want to be. And then further medicalizing something as fundamental to all of our lives as food has a severe impact psychologically on both the person that's receiving the blended diet or the enteral nutrition and those that are in the family around it. And when you take somebody away from something like an occasion, Christmas, birthdays, all of those things, there's always food. It doesn't matter what culture, religion, anything, anywhere in the world, food is at the center of almost all aspects of our lives. And if you take somebody away from that, it has a dramatic impact. And although it's going to be different using a feeding tube, picking the food, engaging in the process, sitting around the table, it's a lot more natural and feels more wholesome than being connected to a pump and being separated from the other people around that shared experience of the meal. So I think that's really important. And there has been some good research published on the psychosocial aspects, but it's a lot more difficult to tangibly get away from the anecdotal evidence that supports that. But it's something we hear all the time from people that are using Wilbo's blends, that's a really important thing, and I absolutely feel it every day. And I suppose, well, I'll tell you at this point. I might come on to it later, actually. But if you get an M-fit syringe, a birthday candle fits perfectly in the top of it. So every birthday William has, or his siblings, or we have, there's a candle in the top of a syringe, which looks a bit peculiar, but when you live our lives, it's quite a special moment for us. So that's William. That's a little picture of William there. He's much bigger than that now, but there is no right or wrong way of this, and I always try to present this in a way that some people think that there's a choice between blended diet and formula, and I'm not anti-formula or in any way. There's absolutely a place for it, and somewhere along the spectrum is what works for everybody. Now, what we do find is most people that start on a blended diet see benefits from it and try to do more and more of it, which is a good positive thing. But also, we all have busy, complex lives, and blending part food with formula has a positive effect for a lot of people. A combination of the two. Sometimes people have even overnight feeds of formula and then food during the day, and everybody's situation is unique to them, and you find what works for you, and that's just a point in time, and it'll change and flux and evolve over time. But absolutely, there's no right or wrong. They're not mutually exclusive. They can be used in combination. And it's really important to think about that. And we talk about transition as well, and moving away from formula if you're already on it. But increasingly, people start on blended diet immediately and never go on to formula. And those people that do that don't typically ever start on formula. So this feels a bit clinical perhaps, but it's a good framework, and all clinicians in any specialty tend to follow something similar to this, which is they bring together these three components, which is the research and scientific evidence, empirical evidence to support practice, the service user values and preferences, which is critically important here and is actually the thing that drove blended diet to be as popular and well researched as it now is. And then the practitioner expertise and judgment. And lots of policies exist, lots of frameworks of practice exist, but there's always a degree of judgment that needs to be used and applied. And I always say in this space particularly, everything that when somebody goes through a dietetics undergraduate degree, they never get trained on blended diet or really particularly into enteral nutrition at all. Everything they learn on how to make people healthier through food applies to people that are being fed by a feeding tube as well. So we just need to switch the mindset a little bit and apply that in a different way of taking the food on board, but it's still the same principles that support it. And that's true if you're trying to manage other conditions in parallel. So, for example, we look at ketogenic diet for control of seizures, diabetes. All of those things are well researched and practiced in control using diet, and that can be applied for people using a feeding tube just as much as those already eating in most instances. So the best research and scientific evidence. So in the last 4 years, there's been over 100 papers published on blended diet in some capacity, and I've just pulled a few out here just to highlight kind of the key areas where and I kind of mentioned a few of them before, but the big one that everybody seems to, from a clinical point, absolutely look at is the improved symptoms. Long-term outcomes is something slightly different, but we'll come on to that. But parents report reductions in reflux, vomiting, constipation, all the GI intolerances that I talked about before. And that is really, really important. So when William was much younger, we went everywhere with a foldable silicone dog bowl because he would vomit absolutely every single meal. And it's horrible to see. It's horrible for him. It's horrible for everybody around him. And we were told it was reflux, and he was on, omeprazole, all kind of protein pump inhibitors, and he was on Movicol, picosulfate, all sorts of stuff to manage these symptoms. And actually, we were managing the symptoms rather than addressing what was causing the problem. And actually, when we transitioned him onto the blended diet, 24, 48 hours later, his seizures had improved and all of these symptoms went away to the point now that he's not on any symptom management meds for his gastrointestinal tract at all, um, which was a massive step forward. And actually, his respiratory condition and everything else improved as a result, so he wasn't aspirating. So symptoms is the thing that gets the most focus for good reason, because it has a huge impact on everybody involved in the care and the person themselves. The psychosocial benefits I kind of mentioned a little bit before, so I'll not talk about it too much, but it's getting more attention, and I think it's really important for the lives that we all live with somebody with complex needs. Nutritional adequacy is something that gets raised as an objection now and again, but there has been some good studies now, and nobody interrogates people that are eating orally to make sure that they're having a good enough diet. And actually, I do think care needs to be applied to this, but as long as you follow the same kind of practice, and but by the way, most people on a blended diet have a much healthier diet than those that don't, because it's quite easy to put some kale into a blender rather than it is to try and get a 6 or 7 year old to eat kale any other way, in my experience. But nutritional adequacy, there is no evidence at all. But we do have people occasionally that fixate on calories and then maybe have too much fat in their diet and therefore go into ketosis. And there's good reasons for that. But the dietitian should be able to support and direct you on how to do that. And it doesn't need to be overthought, but at the same time, it does need some attention. One of the things that I would mention around nutritional adequacy as an objection that comes up all the time is the concept of having a nutritionally complete diet. So with formula, every single meal has to be nutritionally complete in a formula. None of us have a nutritionally complete meal ever. So why we're trying to impose that, it makes no sense logically. There's no clinical research to support why we'd have a nutritionally complete diet over a single meal. But over the course of 24, 48 hours a week, that's when we need to get our nutritional completeness. So really, nutritional adequacy should come more from variety and not having the same thing over and over again, rather than any other way of looking at it. And we're starting to see a lot more research generally in gut health around 30 different plant sources of fiber and those kind of things. And that's what should be considered more than individual portions in each meal being nutritionally complete. Clinical outcomes. So we're starting to see a little bit more research specifically in this, but what we'd like to see is a longer term study across this with a larger patient cohort group, because you can see immediately that patients reduce if they're not aspirating through vomiting and all of those other things, that respiratory infections and medication reduced. There is some evidence to support that there's few acute admissions and the length of stay in hospitals reduced for people that are on blended diet. But we need to build that evidence base that supports that in a lot more studies to be able to learn too much from it, which there just isn't enough data at the moment in a more generalized way. And then safety concerns. So if you're not feeding past the stomach, so if you're feeding into the stomach, because the stomach is an important infection barrier, then we just need to use sensible, good practice, clean things properly, store things properly, don't leave things on the side. And it's something that we all do most of the time for all of our food in the house, and we just need to apply the same principles. But obviously, if you've got somebody that's neutropenic or immunocompromised, then a lot more focus needs to be done this. And if you are bypassing the stomach, again, potentially with a JED tube or any post-pyloric tube, then a different approach needs to be taken to that, because the infection exposure is much higher and the ability to respond to it is much higher. There was a case, I think it was 2 years ago now, in the Mayo Clinic, when somebody hung a blended diet meal for 8 hours and they contracted botulism as a result. So the risk is very real, but it's very easily managed as long as you're using, good food safety practice. So practitioner expertise and judgment. I think this does happen a lot in adults still, but thankfully it's improving. that a lot of people just push back immediately, and clinicians are non-supportive and say you can't do blended diet. In fact, very rarely does that happen in pediatrics anymore, and it's improving in the UK. But there is still that thing. But practitioners need to use their judgment as well. So there's a lot of things that are policies that are out of date or that can't be relied upon. Things like the rate you should feed somebody, or the type of tubes that can be used. There's a lot of misinformation out there or misunderstanding out of there. So this concept of a shared decision making, including the healthcare professionals and the patient and the carers involved, all needs to come together for it to be worked effectively, and that there is a degree of judgment that needs to be done. But what I always say when I'm talking to the clinicians is saying, if you tell a parent or a carer that they can't do something, they're just going to do it anyway. They're just not going to tell you. And that's a far greater risk. But most of the time, you will get supportive people. Where we do have occasionally people push back, then we're happy for them to be signposted to us, and they can speak to our dietitians or people within our team, and we can provide them with the evidence that they'll need to be able to move forward. But yeah, as I say, thankfully, at least in the UK, we're seeing fewer objections than we used to do in paediatrics. And in adults, sometimes we just signpost the same team to their paediatric colleagues because that's where the knowledge is. And then this is just a important thing. This is UK specific. So the Care Quality Commission have regulations around food, and in Regulation 14, now I know I won't go into too much detail about this, it basically says that we should be providing choice for food and drink to all of the patients and to meet their diverse needs as long as it's reasonable. So if somebody isn't doing that, they're in breach of the CQC regulations, and sometimes it's important just to highlight that. But I would rather not use this as kind of a weapon or a hammer to try and change practice. I think we can guide in a way to show that it's safe, and all the evidence that supports the blended diet is a lot better for patients than formula. All of the research supports that's out there, so we shouldn't have to use this. But it's important to recognise that why would we be applying this to oral eaters and giving them the chance to select and make choices around their food and drink, and not to people with a feeding tube without any other contraindications? And I think this is why it's important just to recognise that this exists. So the problem, and that's probably a bit of a blunt way of phrasing it, but there is still problems. So as much as the research has come on a long way, practice has improved dramatically over the past 5 years for sure. But there's still a huge variance in practice, and this poses a big problem. So in community, people might be doing a blended diet and then have an acute admission to a hospital and get told that they can't have that anymore, have a blended diet, and what are the consequences of that. We have people that, if you look at the hospital avoidance, this happens far more often than I care to remember or like. But people that will refuse to go to hospital when they should do, because they know they'll be put back on formula and the consequence of being put back on formula. And we had, I think, at least 2 this last winter that ended up in intensive care because they refused to go to the ward early enough for a chest infection, and one person developed pneumonia. And it could have been avoided if the hospital had just not been seen as banning blended diet. Now, hospitals increasingly stock Wilbo's blends and provide blended diet, but there's still a huge variance in where that's accepted and not. Training. So healthcare professionals aren't trained in this. There was no course available. We now train the dietitians, and we train the nurses and a few doctors as well in blended diet. But we've got a long way to go in training more people, and we want it to be integrated into more standard continued professional development. So that is a barrier that we're trying to resolve, like all of the other barriers, but there's a long way to go there. And then resource and access, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the resources that are out there and available for people looking to start the blended diet, and also to support them in engaging with their healthcare professional teams in a more informed way to get a better decision, be that to use blended diet or not to use blended diet, but just to make the right decision for their circumstances. I'll take a pause. Is there any questions at that point? Because I feel like I've not breathed an awful lot for half an hour.
No, honestly, Gareth, it's very interesting. What we've had in the chat so far is quite a lot of enthusiasm for the birthday candle idea. So that's a great tip. Thank you. And I asked a question in the chat was really whether other people in the audience were using a blended diet or thinking about wanting to give it a go. And somebody's replied, definitely want to give it a go. Would love to see Wilbo's blends in Ireland. I don't know whether that.
Is in Ireland, yeah. So it is in Ireland. So
Oh, brilliant. That's great news.
yeah, we ship across the EU now. We have an EU distribution centre for our meals, so that's no problem, no customs issues, and any of that stuff. We've recently just resolved that, and also just had something pop up. Sarah D entered the waiting room.
Oh yeah, yeah.
That's cool. And then also, so Belfast Hospital now stock Wilbo's blends for inpatients as well. So they're starting to do that, and we've got a lot more engagement with the Southern Ireland hospitals, Cork, and we did a training session in Dublin for those. So it takes a long time for this to change, but they're definitely going in the right direction. So yeah, I think Ireland is in good shape relatively, I think.
That's very good news. Thank you for sharing that. And I think change takes a long time, doesn't
It
it?
does. It does, and for good reason as well. I always
Yeah,
say, it's very frustrating for us as people that want to use this, but at the same time, making changes to people that are medically complex already, it needs to have the right processes and controls around it. Sometimes it's incredibly frustrating, but it's there for the right reason. So you have to remind myself of that as much as everybody else sometimes.
yeah. And I think the part that you said at the beginning about building that evidence base is just so important, isn't it?
Absolutely, and the evidence base is absolutely there now. We don't need any more research to say blended diet is better. What I'd like to see is more research being done on more specific, like condition specific uses and how you can adapt diets to help in specific situations. But as the overall umbrella concept of it, there's plenty of evidence now. We shouldn't keep reinventing the wheel. There's not
Yeah,
enough research money available
yeah,
to
yeah, yeah.
reinvent the wheel.
Totally agree. And somebody else in the chat says would love to see all hospitals, schools, and restaurants offer Wilbos. And I can imagine that you would also quite like for
Yeah,
that to happen.
of course, but I'd also say that like we are huge supporters of home blending. We don't really want people to be using Wilbo's blends all the time. It's really there for convenience, and we all need that convenience. And when you're away from home, at school, in hospital, it's perfect. It works brilliantly. But
Yeah,
also, I blend at home all the time because I William has last night he had lasagna because we had lasagna, and it's really important for us that he's involved in the same meals as us as well. So those two things aren't mutually exclusive, and there's been times where we've been a lot more reliant because William's been really unwell and we've been managing lots of other things, and I think that's
yeah,
everybody's circumstance. So but I'd love it, yeah,
yeah,
restaurant as well. I'd love to be able to go out and it just be part of the conversation, but we're
yeah,
probably a little bit further away from that than we'd like.
yeah. We'll get there. Okay, you can carry on now and talk about William, who looks adorably cute on this slide.
Not a bad slide to dwell on there actually, because he is cute there, but he's also tiny there, and he's much bigger than that, and I he's non-verbal, so he can't tell me, but he's not as cute as that anymore, I'm afraid. So he has a genetic mutation. There's only one other in the world with the same genetic mutation that's documented, which is probably not too alien for a lot of the people that are to listening in on this. And how that presents itself is obviously there's a lot of uncertainty because there isn't a point of reference for how his condition will evolve. But he's non-verbal. He can't walk. He can't sit unaided. He had failure to thrive, and then went onto a feeding tube. So he's never eaten orally. He doesn't have a safe swallow. He's had all sorts of different surgeries. He's got a vagal nerve stimulator for seizures. So he's had an awful lot of interventions and an awful lot of mostly for epilepsy. He's had an awful lot of pharmaceutical interventions as well, and still is. But the one thing that had the biggest impact on William's life through all of that is when we we changed him from being on formula to going on to the blended diet. And this is, almost a decade ago now. But I was kind of looking at this, and we'd just been in intensive care, and so your head's all over the place. And I was unpacking boxes and boxes of formula. A whole month arrived, and that was going to be his food for the month. And nobody even spoke to us in any way. It was a fait accompli. This is what enteral nutrition looks like, and William needs it. And we absolutely knew that. William was tiny. He was really he wasn't growing, and there was a lot of uncertainty. But I was like, this can't be right for him. I wouldn't eat this. I wouldn't give this to anybody else. So how can this be okay for him when he's got so much else going on? There wasn't a lot of research out there. There wasn't a lot of evidence, but we just started introducing food. And within 24 hours, his seizures improved. 48 hours, we started to see even more improvement. And we did this without telling anybody because we were told we couldn't do it. And then, I think a couple of months later, his hair was growing. I think he actually got to like the first percentile after like months and months of just being desperate. And then we told people this is what we were doing, and you can tell us to stop, but we're not going to, because it had a huge impact on him, more than anything else that's ever been done for William. And also had a huge impact on us as well. We didn't have to carry bowls to catch vomit all the time and all that other stuff around, which seems trivial, but our washing machine was probably as grateful as anything else in our house at the time. So as a result of that, I decided in my sleep-deprived wisdom that we needed to do something that would help other people as well in the same situation, because we met these people all the time that were in a very similar situation. And that's really where the idea of Wilbo's Blends came from. We didn't know what it would look like at the start. We never set out with a plan to make meals or resources or anything else. We just knew we had to do something. And then I guess we moved for, I think my wife looked at me across the kitchen and just thought, oh no, what's he got in his head now? But I have no idea at the time, but we knew we had to do something because of the impact it had on William, and still is. So what it looks like now in terms of our meals, a few of you will have seen these if you were there on Saturday, but we have 4 recipes there, stuff that you would get from a cookbook or a restaurant maybe, but we want it to feel naturally like real food. So there's nothing in here, there's no preservatives, no additives, it's just real food, and it's all organic. And there's a few different calorie densities. It's all developed to ITSE level 3. So ITSE is a framework that talks about the viscosity and the thickness, how it goes through a feeding tube, really. So it's all consistent, so it works. It works with the next generation of pump that's available now if you do need a feeding pump. And it's shelf stable, so when you buy it, you can keep it in the kitchen cupboard. It doesn't have to be in the fridge until it's opened and all those things, which that convenience part is incredibly important. And as we say, as there's a picture of a blender in the back of that picture as well, home blending is absolutely brilliant, and you can use it in combination, and that's what we hope people do. And then I'll just skip over that. So patient resources, if you go to the Wilbo's Blends website, there's also a load of resources that we've created, brought professionals together to help with this. And this is really, there is a really good toolkit, the one that I mentioned earlier, that's going to be the Bacon toolkit soon. This is not, I think that's 86 pages and quite, excuse the pun, hard to digest. This is aimed really at people, patients themselves and carers and families, to understand it at the right level, to grasp it, ask the questions, and then engage with their healthcare professionals. It's certainly not there to replace the professional input. It's there to augment the conversation and help you make the decisions that are right for you, and just some tips and handy things that are useful to you. So we always signpost to that, and we get a lot of people going to that and finding it really useful. Globally, there's people that go to the website for the resources, so they're there for you. The slides keep jiggling about all by themselves, so apologies. I mentioned that before, this was the last training course, and as you can see, it's about 50-50 nurses, and so on this course there was nurses from Great Ormond Street who, because they use Wilbo's Blends, but now they can administer on one of the wards in Great Ormond Street, and the rest were dietitians. So this is just the training that we do for the healthcare professionals now. And then, so that's very much focused at healthcare professionals. This is about to launch in the next week or two, I say, with nobody else to correct me, but I hope in 2 weeks it'll be available. And this is 10 online e-learning modules. So you can go on, there's downloadable resources, but it takes you through every step of the stages in terms of, is it right for you, what equipment you should be using, from gastrostomies and as well as blenders and all of the information you need, food safety, and some recipes. And there's a recipe book that comes with it, kind of downloadable one, and all this sort of stuff. So this is focused very much on patients, carers, and families that are looking to use a blended diet. And that's not quite available, but imminently. I'll just quickly mention this. It's not ours. Cardinal Health are the biggest pump manufacturer in the world. They're massive in the States. I'll not go into it, but there's reasons why they're not in the UK, and that's because of the way procurement is. They don't have a nutrition business, and the nutrition business funds pumps in the UK. So you'll have a Nutrition or an Abbott one probably if you're in the UK. But this does, and it's tested by us, and it works for IDSI level 3 in our meals. So if you do need a feeding pump, there is a solution for it, although it's hard to get because the ICBs and the trusts don't want to fund it because of the way the contracts are set up. And then I don't know what's going on the slide, so apologies. But this is the first ever Wilbo's Blends meal that was sent out. It literally the first order, and somebody had an acute admission that they hadn't planned, and this was the first ever message that came to our inbox after we'd launched it. And that is really a little reminder of why we do this, and it keeps us very grounded. And although I do blended diet every day with William, everybody within Wilbo's Blends, we try to stay as close and connected to the people that we do this for. And this was a fabulous thing to get, and they're still going strong, these guys, and hopefully, well, they'll be at home, I hope now. But it's a nice message. And there's reviews on our website, but everybody loves Wilbo's Blends, but I'm biased, of course. But it's really nice and important that we get these messages. We got a message yesterday, actually. Somebody has booked their first ever holiday in 7 years, because they feel they're confident enough to travel because they've got a solution for the food now that they didn't have before. And that again just reminds us why we do this. So quickly to summarize, and I've got a video and hopefully it'll play afterwards, which was sent to us, but the use of the blended diet continues to grow. It's more prevalent and it's going into a wider group of patients, adults, pediatrics, but also disease-specific groups like motor neuron disease, which I'll come on to in a second. The evidence is there. I won't bang on about this too much, but anybody that gets pushed back, they need to signpost to the evidence or need somebody to signpost to the evidence. Come to us. There's enough evidence to support blended diet without even looking anymore. Like a quick Google search will point to all the papers. There's significant problems still, and most of that's due to the time it takes for healthcare practices to change, but it is changing and it's being adopted widely. Hospitals are doing it now. Community are doing it now. It is changing, but we all need to advocate and push for it still, which I'd like that to be less of the case, but it's the reality. But the benefits are dramatic and for a lot of people, and I think it's important that we recognise that and support people to be able to make the choices that deliver the best outcomes for them and best life and happiness. And then the solutions and innovations are coming, and the reason I put the pump up there is important because we're seeing the big players, and healthcare is an incredibly big industry. And when you start seeing the really big market leaders changing practice to support blended diet by introducing IDSI compliant pumps and things like that, it shows that that's the direction of travel, but it will just take an awful long time to get there. Now, I know, so motor neuron disease is not necessarily right in the unique kind of camp, but this video was sent to us. We never asked for it. It was just sent to us by somebody that's a Wilbo's Blends user. So I'll just play it because it always is important to keep close to this. So if it plays, I hope it will.
Living with MND means facing daily challenges, but one thing that's made a huge difference for me is Wilbo's Blends. When eating and drinking became difficult, I needed a solution that wasn't just about nutrition. It had to be easy, enjoyable, and most importantly, something that worked for me. Jess has been incredible. She prepares my meals, making sure I get everything I need without the stress of planning or struggling with food. With Wilbo's, we know I'm getting real, wholesome nutrition, and that peace of mind is invaluable. The blends are smooth, natural, and packed with everything my body needs. No artificial stuff, no complicated prep, just good, honest food that fuels me through the day. It gives me energy, keeps me strong, and helps me focus on what really matters, spending time with Jess and Oliver and pushing forward with mind over MND. And what's even better, Wilbo's isn't just about the product, it's about a shared mission. They genuinely care about making blended diets more accessible and breaking down barriers for people like me. That's why we're proud to be working together to spread the word and make a difference. So if you or someone you know could benefit from a blended diet, I can't recommend Wilbo's enough. It's more than nutrition. It's freedom, it's choice, and it's support where it matters most. Living with it.
I'll stop sharing now. It's quite nice. So if we'd have tried to have made something, it would never have been as good as that. So I don't know how he did it, but it's a really nice thing that somebody shared that, and I always think it's a good way of finishing that kind of presentation.
It's really very moving video, Gareth, and really I think highlights exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it. Gareth, you're doing just amazing work. I think that's it for the question. So just wanted to say thank you so much for giving this webinar today, but actually really mainly for all the work you've done in sharing your experiences and how with everybody that needs it and all the work you're doing to change things in healthcare. It's really fantastic and will be much appreciated by many of our families.